Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Nice to have you all here. Nice to be back learning together. And it's nice that we have such a good crowd coming back for the second class as we're doing God of Becoming in Relationship. And grateful I did not scare anybody off, or at least not too many of you off last week. So that's a good start. Uh, we got through the introduction last week. We're now entering the bulk of it, which chapter one largely deals with how do we picture and imagine God, and reclaiming a process version of what God is and what our reimagined God is. So before we dive into the book itself, were there any preliminary thoughts, comments, questions, things that were completely unclear? Lisa, go ahead.
Yes, okay. So we may have touched on, I think we might have touched on this last week, but I think I'm still a little bit confused about what is faithfulness and how does faithfulness differ from faith?
So, I don't think he covers faithfulness in this chapter yet.
Well, he mentions it at the very beginning.
At the very beginning.
Or in the very beginning, he says, in the part one, on the first page, he just talks about tremendous possibilities for a faithfulness that is honest, open, spiritually rich, and ethically engaged in the world, on page one.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I was trying to find it. I suspect he'll cover more of what he means by faithfulness in later chapters. I think I don't want to say too much just because one, I think he's going to cover it later, and two, I don't know if I remember the answer at this moment. So I'd have to go read as we read through the book. I'll have to be like, oh, that's what he meant by faithfulness. That's right. So I won't go too deep into it, but I think there is a level at which process theology advanced tremendous possibilities for a faithfulness that is honest, open, spiritually rich, and ethically engaged in the world. I'm not sure there's necessarily a drastic difference between faithfulness and faith in the way that he's using it. How do we make choices and approach our faith in a way that is honest, open, and ethically engaged? How do we walk in this world in a way that exemplifies the faith that we have and informs our decision making? I think that's kind of the way that I'm reading that right now.
Okay, thank you. And it sounds like it will also become clearer as we keep reading.
God willing. Other preliminary thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Diane. You got to unmute first, though.
On page 5,
yes,
that very last sentence at the top of the paragraph, at the top of the page, where it reads, the Bible and the rabbis portray God as vastly, persistently powerful, but not all powerful.
yes.
And it sounds like to me that he's trying to use some words to make it confusing. If he's not all powerful, he's not all powerful. So either he is or he isn't. So I don't know, maybe I'm trying to read too much into it, but I'm just trying to understand what's the point to you, Rabbi? What is the
So
point?
okay, good. So what? Well, uh, what is the point he's trying to make in this first section generally about the good, the bad, and the powerful? Barbara?
Well, I wonder, Diane, would you be happier if it was written as God does a lot of stuff, but he can't do everything? God does a lot of stuff. He has a lot of power.
We all, I think that we're all here because we accept that premise, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So I just wondered if it, right?
Well,
Maybe
I
I'm
think
People
I
come
think
for
these-
lots of different reasons, so I don't want to project too much.
see their friends.
But let's back up for 1 second to what's Rabbi Artson's main point in this opening section? Barbara Ayland?
that God is not perfect, that God is changing with time, and therefore one of the premises of that is that God is not all powerful. He is very powerful, but not completely powerful. So that's the distinction he's making.
Yeah.
Well,
His basic Rabbi Artson's basic argument here is if you ascribe God all the power, then philosophically you have an issue that God actually has no power. And he mentions here, the philosophical tricks that you play. Like, can God create a weight so powerful that God cannot lift it? If God's all powerful, then God should be able to create something so heavy. But if God can't lift it, then God's still not all. Like, either way, it's a paradox in which either way God's not all powerful. So to Barbara's point, both Barbara's points, um, God is on a different level of power than we are. God is vastly, persistently powerful. God has an immense amount of power that we as humans don't have. But God doesn't have all the power, because if God had all the power, that would create some other philosophical issues. Does that make sense?
right. I mean, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cindy, did you have something?
Yeah, I really like how he supports that by saying that, with the text, giving examples why he believes what he believes. And so it's a little easier for me to accept what he's saying because his theory presumably is grounded in the text. But I'm sure there will be others that disagree with him. I'm just very gullible, and it sits very nicely with me.
Well, no, I think that's a little bit of why he cites it. Is it's not just Brad Artson is waxing philosophical, and this is just my personal opinion. He's saying the Torah supports that, the Tanakh supports that opinion. Great is the Holy One and much acclaimed, the one who performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed. It's great power, it's great strength, it's things that we as humans can't do, but it's not all the power. It's not, the power to do virtually everything and anything. For I find the arguments that he has on page 4 that power is relational. I find that somewhat more convincing, or at least personally, than the philosophical conundrum of can God create an item so heavy God can't lift it. I feel like I've heard that before, and I think somewhere there's some philosophical workaround around it. I just don't remember what it is. I think it's out there somewhere. Like there is like a workaround, but this idea of like power being relational does kind of ring true. That there's a dynamic in every relationship in some way, shape, or form. There are times people will say, Rabbi, can you ask that person to do something because they're more likely to say yes to you as the rabbi than they will be to me. Or they're more likely to listen to you as the rabbi. There's a level at which there's a power dynamic being played out there, which is relational. That I have more power in my position than this person asking me feels that they have in whatever position they are in. But if you have all the power, then there's actually no power whatsoever. If I had all the power, then you really have none, and then there's really no relationship whatsoever. So
that was the part where I didn't buy that part at all. Honestly. I was like, you're right. If I have all the power and you have none of the power, then you don't have any of the power, but it doesn't mean I don't have power.
Well,
I
think
may
about it.
well be God in terms of like moving pencils around on my desk because they have no power to resist me, really. But that doesn't mean I have no power. It means they don't have it. But I will also say I think he's being a little loose with his terminology. He's talking about omnipotence and omniscience as though people actually agree on what they mean, and I don't think that's true. But I think the main point is no matter which version of them you use, you walk into philosophical landmines that lead you to contradictions with what you want a just and powerful God to be, and these concepts just don't work together. And I think that's the main point he's trying to make. People have spent hundreds of years trying to get them to make sense, and you wind up either giving the omnipotence up so you can have a reason why bad things happen, or you have to give up the omniscience for a reason why bad things happen, and they don't all hang together with a just God and a reasonable world.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's the point of this entire chapter, is exactly what you said. And I think what he's saying is, it's not even that yes, they don't all work together, but maybe we don't need any of them.
Right.
God doesn't have to have any one of them.
Yeah,
because
I think that's his way out is, if these things don't all work together, maybe we need to find other things. And he's saying, and I think the reason he goes back to the Talmud and scripture is to say these ideas of omniscience and omnipotence are not Jewish in origin, they're Greek. So he's saying we need to get out of this Greek box and find other ways to work out a relationship.
Yes. Barbara Ayland, you look like you were about to say something before.
Well, I hate to add, I thought that was very well said, but it just occurred to me the idea of God having all the power means kind of not having any power. I was thinking about a chess game where God's playing us, but God's moving us. So it's not so much that he doesn't have power, but the power is kind of meaningless because you can't really use it in any way because he's playing both sides of that chess game. And what's the fun of that? I mean,
exactly, what fun would that be? Yeah, that was kind of where I was like, it's not that God doesn't have any power. I can see how it would be kind of pointless if nobody had any freedom or power.
Lisa?
So, I like this train of thought. I mean, the fact that God is not all powerful, all knowing, I can say that easier, and pure goodness, because that definitely helps me to deal with the bad things that happen. So I like that idea. I'm wondering if it means, if you just carry that logically out, does it mean that omnipotence, omniscience, pure goodness, that they really don't exist? There is no really such thing. They're an ideal, but they really don't exist, because if God's not those things, it's anything those things.
I think, yes. I think if you were to extrapolate process theology out, I think it would ultimately get to a point of, yes, none of these things are actually achievable logically. Because if everything's a process and an evolution and change and dynamic, then you can't have the ideal can't actually exist at any point, because then once you hit that ideal, there's nothing left to develop into.
And there's
Esther, I like that you're starting him young.
there's hundreds of years about wondering whether ideas exist or not, and that's also Greek.
Yes. And the first point of his chapter is, yes, I think what Joshua said before is that, instead of trying to reconcile omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, why do we just, that's not what's happening here, that there's something else.
Start somewhere else.
Yes. But, I think the second part is he's trying to strip off the idea that a lot of these are Greek ideas and not, as Joshua said, like they're not native necessarily to the Tanakh and the Bible, and only loosely maybe held by some of the Talmudic rabbis. It's not until you start getting into where Greek philosophy really incorporates more heavily in the medieval period where you start really getting some of these ideas floating into Jewish concepts. And I think part of his point is that's not necessarily what Jews always believed. It's just what, from medieval times, that's kind of what we picked up. You get, sorry, I lost my spot here, but you get into the same concept of all-knowingness, that if God knows everything, then human freedom can't actually exist because God knows ahead of time what we're going to do.
I push back a little bit on that one too. I think omniscience doesn't have to mean knows the future. It could be knows everything that can be known. But it's still problematic because then if God knows everything and can be very powerful, then you could see some things are going to happen in 5 minutes from now and stop them, even if you didn't absolutely know they were going to happen.
Yeah, that is still part of the problem. And I think, a little bit of where he's coming from might be a little bit what I'm hearing from some of you is the way he's using these terms, yes, there might be different philosophical understandings of what these terms mean, but I think popularly speaking, this is the way people are using them. That for most people, when you say omniscience, they're assuming that means all-knowing, not all-knowing, knowing everything that's possible to be known at this particular moment. I think that might be, I'm sure there are philosophers who take that view. I think he's coming from a point of this is kind of the popular understanding and use of these terms.
Well, I mean, I think I'm really trying to shut up and not talk so much. I'm failing miserably, but I think there are a lot of religious people who want God to be omniscient, but also don't want to say they don't have free will and everything is foreordained. And if your omniscience knows everything that is and will be, then you really do have to give rid of free will right away. So I think it's pretty common for people to not go to the absolute total omniscience so that they can feel like they have choices and things.
Well, he did mention that people wave their hands and say mystery. It's a mystery how that all works out, but it does. So, I mean, he wasn't agreeing with that, but he was just saying that's sort of how theologists have tended to do it.
Well, that's especially the way you deal with, like, I don't know why bad things happen to good people. That's a mystery.
Right, and I think that's a little bit what he's trying to argue against here is, it's not a mystery, it's a natural part of the process. Doesn't mean it doesn't stink in the moment, doesn't mean it's not painful, but it's not, it's not that God, the example I come back to is, only because I have a personal connection is, I had a family at a religious school I used to work at, found out later where, the father took his son to a baseball game and the son's like, said, I'm getting a headache. The dad's like, okay, drink some water, have some Tylenol, like, take it easy. And the headache started getting so bad that they left the game early. Kid couldn't sleep all night. And so they took him to the doctor in the morning because the headache was getting progressively worse. And they found out he had an inoperable brain tumor on his brain stem at 6 years old and died 2 weeks later.
Mm.
Okay, so, at that point, you have some questions to ask. What did this kid possibly do to deserve a brain tumor on his brainstem that God thought that was the appropriate response? Or what could this parents have done? If God is all powerful, why didn't God, do something to stop this tumor from developing on the brainstem? To which leads to, question after question after question. And, what Rabbi Artson's trying to argue back is, it's horrible and it's painful and it's a complete and utter tragedy. And it's also not God in control of that. It's, when you take the all powerful part out and the all knowing part out and the all good part out and say, this is a process and God is in process with us, and God is, not static, timeless perfection, as he says on page 6, then, it's awful and it's terrible and it's horrible and it's part of the process of the world and of what's happening. We'll talk about that more when we get to the problem of evil later in a future chapter. But he's trying to say, this, it's no longer that God could have stopped it. That's what he's trying to argue here. Margaret?
So what does this mean for creation?
We're not on that chapter yet.
So God has created a world in which these things can happen. What does that say about creation?
So this is chapter 4. It talks about loosely, I'll kind of briefly say, one of the things I often say about it is, God creates light and dark, and God says,
That's good.
this is good.
Good.
And and the second day, God creates and says, this is good. And the third day, this is good. Fourth, fifth, this is good. Sixth day, God says, this is very good. Nowhere does it say the world was created perfect. No.
I would also argue nobody knows what it means for there to be a perfect world. That's another one of those things people say, like, what's a perfect world? I don't know.
Yes. The world, Rabbi Artson has given the example before is, I don't think he brings it up in this book. If you do, then I apologize for giving you a spoiler. Imagine that there's a world where God, let's put it this way, God could have created a world in which there was no war, no death, no illness, no suffering, none of those things. God could have theoretically created that world. But what's the problem? In order to do that, God would have needed to create a world that was completely static. That means it would be unchanging, undeveloping, and everything would be kind of an eternal statue. So yes, there would be no death, there would be no illness, there'd be no injuries, there would also be no birth, there would also be no love, there'd be no emotion, because emotion involves change. No growth. So instead, God created a dynamic world, one that is ever changing. And part of the trade-off of creating a dynamic world is You can grow, you can learn from your mistakes, you can fall in love, you can create new life and reproduce, you can, hug your friends. Um, but the trade off is, everything changes along with it. So that means your body gets older, and as your body gets older, it doesn't work the way it did when it was younger. It means that sometimes DNA mutates and creates um, disorders that get passed down from generation to generation. It means sometimes cells reproduce in funky ways that cause tumors to grow on children's brain stems. It you know that's part of the trade-off of living in a changing world. It's not a perfect world. But it's the world that God created.
I'm
Barter
happy
Brandy?
with, I'm happy with you talking about change, but I wonder, did man not create God so that they would have an answer to why? And if we had an answer, if we didn't have God, or if you don't believe in God, then you don't need to say, well, does God know what he did? Does God have anything to do with what happened? And I hope that I get to the answer to that by the end of the book, because what we're talking about starts out assuming that there's a God.
So, on some level, look, I'll say two things. On some level, what you're asking is an anthropological question, not a theological question.
I don't get that answer.
Um, you're asking, why did humanity create this concept of God, which, presumes a world in which people didn't know why things worked the way they did, so they attributed it to some supernatural force that was greater than and beyond the natural world, and that God, in that sense, in some sense, is a figment of our imaginations and was created by our own will, out of our own need to explain what we otherwise couldn't explain. That's an anthropological question of how we developed religion and the idea of a deity. That's not a question of theology, because theology comes in with and rightfully so, I think, that philosophy generally has to work with some understated presuppositions. So he's, Rabbi Artson's writing a book of theology, and is presupposing that the person reading this book of theology is coming in with a concept of either some question of what God is, which presumes some belief in a God of some sort that, Rabbi Artson's now trying to outline what that looks like.
Well, one thing that I think Rabbi Artson or process theology, I won't put it all on Rabbi Artson. Process theology is changing God's unlimited power or God's all-knowing. It's changing those three things because it wants us to believe that God is flexible, is evolving, is changing as needed, etc. So now go to the other side. Okay, I'm fine. There's God. How does God feel about that change in his level of power?
On some level, I think Rabbi Artson would argue that what we are doing is uncovering what and who God has always been all along. And that if you look at God's revelation through the Tanakh and through the interpretations of the Tanakh, which, according to rabbinic tradition, are still divinely revealed, that We are just uncovering who and what God has always been, rather than, changing who or God, what God has been. We're coming to a deeper, better understanding, which is fine. It helps us
No, and
deepen our relationship with knowing who God is more on a deeper, different level than we had.
then, as has already been said this morning, I will become more comfortable with what process theology is saying, or Rabbi Artson is saying, as long as he keeps backing it up with examples and texts and quotes, as he did. I mean, yes, we're only at the beginning, but this is all new to me, so I do need him to keep doing his quotes.
Yes, and if you haven't, he does occasionally, he is quoting. There are some good footnotes in the back which tell
Yeah.
you where he's getting the quotes from
Yeah.
and the thoughts from. There hasn't been so much on, where he's quoting scripture and rabbinic texts. Look like primarily. I'm skipping into like looking at the notes on chapter 2. He does quote some in chapter 2 where he's quoting, this is that such and such, like Rambam and Ibn Ezra, but I think largely it looks like skimming. He's quoting Tanakh directly in the text, but might say, rabbinic texts say X, Y, and Z, and then we'll put an end note in there that you can go back and look at.
Yeah.
Cindy?
So in light of the fact that we're talking about like a different vision of God, does he ever deal in this book about why believe in God? Or is that another book altogether?
To remember, I don't remember if Rabbi Artson covers that question generally. What I kind of suspect is that process theology would kind of say, a process theologian would make the argument that you believe in God, you don't believe in God. It doesn't change the fact that the process is happening around you anyway. So, you say, I don't believe in God. Well, when faced with a choice, you still have some sense of a right choice and a wrong choice, or a good choice and a bad choice, or a good choice and a less good choice. You still have choices that you make, and you still have a sense of the path that you're trying to go down. So, you want to say that's not God, that's fine. I want to say that is God, that's fine. It's still the process happens whether or not you're actually believing in God luring you towards the right choice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess basically you're saying this is not going to answer my question.
I don't know if he tackles the question of why you should believe in God generally.
Well, because it's sort of like sort of what Lisa was saying initially about faith, and what Barbara is saying, and I guess I'm sort of like a chicken in the road when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll feel different after we read a bit.
I'll see what Barbara Ayland, and then if
Well, I was just going to say, what's the point of telling someone why they should believe in God? You either believe in God or you don't. It's not like you have a choice to make yourself believe in God. That's what is a little frustrating to me when people are like, oh, but if you believe in God, okay, great. I wish I did, but I don't. So what am I going to do about it? I mean, but yeah.
Not believing in God is a choice. You are making the choice of what you believe and don't believe.
No, it's in you. I mean,
I think it's a question in some sense, do you care? I think like if you don't care about the question of whether or not there's a God, theology is going to have no interest to you. You could want there to be a God, you could care if there's a deeper meaning, but don't feel like you believe in something. And it could be that you just deeply don't believe in anything, or it could be that you haven't found an explanation of God that you're willing to let past your rational filter to believe in it. So I think there it's like, it's not that either you believe or you don't. I think the world is full of people, including sometimes Rabbi Nachman, who really wanted to believe things and sometimes weren't sure how to believe things, or really did believe things but didn't know how they managed to believe them.
Josh, I feel known. Feel known. That describes.
So, but what I think this is doing is like he's trying to say, if you're one of those people who wants to believe or feel like you do believe, but you can't get past this omniscient, omnipotent God in a world where crappy things happen to lots of people, here's a different way to let your brain past that.
I really kind of agree with that. I think the whole premise of process theology is about figuring out how we interpret God, and whether we interpret God as this Greek mythology, all-knowing, or as a spiritual essence, a creative essence that somehow is there in partnership with us. Just like an artist may paint something, but then they put it out in the world. They don't know how people are going to react to it or what it's going to mean to people. And everybody puts their own spin on it. So to me, and maybe I'm very simplistic, but this doesn't seem that complicated. It seems like someone's struggle to really understand how we can have faith and faithfulness in some sort of spiritual being or essence. I won't even call it a being, but an essence that I think many of us feel but can't define, without thinking that it has control over much other than giving us some rules to live by. And that is even a question to me. One of my questions is, do we believe that the Torah was written by the hand of God or inspired, godly inspired? Because that also is a partnership between man and this higher ideal essence that we are all striving for, that maybe some of us call God.
Beautifully said by both Joshua and Esther. I'll add one more layer to what they're saying, which is a lot of people, I think, look at what is going on scientifically and saying how this doesn't seem to correspond with the Bible and with the Torah and with the understanding of God that I have grown up with. And I think part of what Rabbi Artson's trying to slowly get to is, you're right, because the concept is flawed, not the core. And that you can, this is one of Rabbi Artson's big things, is you can believe in science and you can believe in religion, and the two should work in tandem with each other to help you better understand the world in which you live. And there's a place in which science should be calling out bad religion, and there's a place in which religion should be calling out bad science. But they should work together to help better inform you of the world you live in and how you can live a deeper, more meaningful life. Margaret, did you have something? I thought I saw your hand up, but okay.
I'll pass.
Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Esther.
One of the questions that this really does raise, and it speaks to, I think, what Cindy brought up, we have a big role in the creation of God, I think. And the creation of what we think is ideal, and why believe, maybe why believe is because there are some words of wisdom in our texts and in our Torah. There's also some horrible shit in our Torah. And and it really, I am actually, and this is one of the things that kept me up this week, not the only thing, but I don't want to take us off track, but I struggle with Sarah being one of the matriarchs that we pray to. Sarah, who threw her stepchild out in the wilderness to die, and her, whatever, that woman, the other woman, out to die. And this is a virtue that we somehow call her a matriarch. I struggle with that. I struggle with some of these stories because, I look at her and go, you caused a lot of trouble that we're still dealing with and cleaning up after.
But we don't pray to her. We don't pray to her. She literally is a matriarch if we descended from her, right?
We pray in her name. We look to her for guidance. What is that? Baruch atah in the name of Rebecca, Leah, Sarah, and Rachel.
Well, it's so, in that sense, I think
my matriarchs in that prayer.
So
and
I'll say a couple things there. At least to that last point, it's we don't say Baruch atah Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah. We say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Riv. And the way the rabbis understand that is, why does it say, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov? Why doesn't it just say, Elohei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov? Like, it could have said the God of each of, like, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why did it have to say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob? And the answer is because each of them had a different relationship with God at different times, like in their life. That the relationship Isaac had with God was different than the relationship Abraham had, which is both were different than the one Jacob had. So in that sense, it's the God of Sarah, but we're not praying to Sarah. We're praying to,
so that is
God.
That is in support of this process theology.
Yes.
God of Sarah may have given her some other advice. She just did it her own way.
To one of your earlier points, Rabbi Artson used to do a Q&A at lunch like once a month. And I remember at one of the Q&A, it was one of the couple that really stand out that I remember, somebody said, there's a line in Hallel that where it says the dead do not praise God. And she's like, this is like the most horrible thing I have read, and it's terrible, and I don't understand how we can say this. And Rabbi Artson looked at her and said, if that's the worst thing that you read in the Tanakh, you're not reading the Tanakh. There's a lot worse things that happen in the Tanakh than that line. Like, read a little more carefully. I have this thought of, and I think it plays into Rabbi Artson's idea also, is you read Greek mythology, what do you get? You get a lot of ideal people who have one small flaw. You think of Hercules, who, I always think of Hercules as the prototypical dumb jock. He's super strong, super athletic, super things. He's not super bright, but he has every physical characteristic you could ever ask for. You think of Achilles, the great warrior, who has like a small flaw in his heel. They all have these great idealistic things, but like a small flaw that makes them human. when you read the Tanakh, you don't get that. You get the story of you get story after story after story of really flawed people struggling to live a good life. And sometimes they do the right thing and sometimes they really don't. And I think that's part of what makes the Tanakh so powerful and why it's endured for so many. It's endured more than Greek mythology has, in some sense. That, yes, we still study Greek mythology, but not in the same way we study the Bible anymore. It's endured in a sense because it's a story of humanity, and humans ain't perfect, and we make the wrong choice sometimes, and the people, David makes the wrong choice sometimes. Sarah doesn't always live up to the best of what we would imagine. Jacob, you know Jacob tricks everybody around him until he gets tricked himself. And it takes essentially a life-changing moment for him until he realizes, I can't keep tricking everybody in my life anymore. Like, I've been tricking myself as much as I've been tricking everybody else. And I need to change who I am. And at that point, it's a little late in his life to do it, and he ends up getting tricked. But it doesn't mean it's not holy. It means we can still learn from it. But they're people, and people, we respect the people and respect who they were and what they did and what they set up for us and how we are descendants of them, but that we don't hold them up as perfect. The rabbis tried to whitewash a lot of them frequently. They'll try to cover up a lot of the misdeeds, but I think there is a way to read some of these texts and say it's all the more powerful because they're not perfect. Karen?
I'm so glad I came to this class. It's a good group. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I was just going to say that I like what you just said, Rabbi, and that it's really comforting to me in my own process to have those imperfect people at imperfect time, because we're all part of like a context. And so it helps me do my own teshuvah.
Thank God.
Thank God. Ugh.
And I do want to say I was maybe a little dismissive of the rabbinic midrashim of what they do with some of the characters, but I think it's also important to remember why they do it. And some of it is because they're trying to teach something else by creating the midrashim that are trying to cover, quote what I said, whitewash some of the characters. I don't think they're doing it maliciously. I think they're doing it because they're trying to teach something else by doing it. They're trying to put some of their values and lessons into the biblical characters to further the conversation from there. Because you might learn one lesson from the Tanakh. They're trying to say there's another lesson you can learn here. Lisa?
So I don't know if Rabbi Artson would say this, but I guess I kind of like the idea that the Torah itself is a process, and that it's like a living, changing, dynamic document that, you know, doesn't just have one meaning, that it evolves with how we have evolved as humankind.
Yeah. You know, again, I'll say maybe two things on that. I think one is, you know, the famous rabbinic statement that God gave both the written and the oral Torah to us to Moses on Mount Sinai, which means both, you know, the Tanakh as we have it, but also every interpretation of the Torah, in a sense that we're uncovering as we go. We're uncovering more and more of what God actually wanted to tell us. But you know, Rabbi Elliot Dorff has this great observation: is that if you look at the blessings before we read the Torah, what does it say? Sher Natan Lanu Torat Emet, who gave us the Torah of truth. Natan being in the past tense. But how do we conclude the blessing? Baruch atah notein haTorah. Notein in the present tense. That, you know, the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai was a one-time historical event. But God reveals and gives us the Torah daily, over and over and over, and it's continuously being revealed. If we, you know, every time we study it, more and more is being revealed to us as we do it. So as you said, it's a process, you know, Torah as a process as well. Revelation is a process that is constantly happening. Margaret Aylan, did you have something, or did Esther?
This may be a little off too, but you know, I was thinking about conservative Judaism and the impact of process theology on conservative Judaism. Because when I think about this kind of process, I think of Reconstructionist Judaism, which happens to speak to me a lot. So that's my question.
So Reconstructionism generally would, you know, it does fit well into that, because reconstructing Judaism has this concept of Judaism as a civilization, and the civilization is defined by the people who are living in that civilization. So, you know, how do you determine what the rules of the society are? The people determine the rules of the society. I think conservative Judaism has long, and again, this is, I think, a Rabbi Dorfism, is that halakha is like an organism. And, you know, as organisms grow and change, you think of our skin, for example. What happens as we grow and change? Some of the cells die and they come up, and they kind of, you know, brush them off. It's part of the evolutionary process of the organism, is that the halakha evolves along with the people, and with the world, and that's kind of the process. So I think process theology would work well with that, in that I think process theology would work well in that if it's an organism, then it's under a process. It's in organisms are constantly evolving and changing and dynamic. I think where I like to think of some of the difference between conservative and reconstructing is who has the authority to alter the halakha. And I think Reconstructionism takes the approach that ultimately whatever the people are doing is what the halakha is. So if, you know, to use one example, if 5% of the population keeps kosher, how can you say that, you know, one of the norms of the society is keeping kosher? The people aren't doing it, so it's kind of evolved itself out. I'm not conservative Judaism would not make that declaration. Is that, you know, we might have the right to evolve the halakha and the law along with the morals and the ethics of the current society, and that, but that if there's no ethical objection, there's no reason to cut out halakha.
So I didn't understand that about Reconstructionist Judaism. My understanding, and I'm not a scholar, is that not so much that it's the popular belief, but that what is important to hold on to is what has meaning. So that kashrut, and when I go to Reconstructionist services, they are often very similar to conservative, but that what has meaning is what is there to hold on to. So if observing kashrut is meaningful, then that's what you do. It's more based on the meaningfulness of it, which then how would halachic change in conservative Judaism? Because again, we're in this partnership in process. And let's say, first of all, we know that a very small percentage of conservative Jews, at least in Birmingham, Alabama, observe kashrut.
So, I'm a conservative rabbi, not a Reconstructionist rabbi. So what I'm sharing is mostly my understanding of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan's writings. People may have evolved Reconstructionist ideology in the 40 years since he passed, which is entirely possible, and I might just not be up to date on my Reconstructionist ideology. So, that's a distinct possibility. I do think there's a level at which, the people will hold on to what's meaningful and will let go of what's not meaningful. And so they'll stop observing that which is not meaningful. And, when it's no longer meaningful and they're no longer observing it, it kind of falls off. It's no longer, as Kaplan would say, it's no longer a norm of the society. That's my understanding. Reconstructionist services can resemble conservative ones. Another, there's a wide variety of Reconstructionist services. I've been to some that are, indistinguishable from, I'm sorry, you would never imagine it was a Jewish service based on the fact of that, what was going on in that service. I think there's a variety of Reconstructionist practice generally. But I think, one of Kaplan's big things was eliminating all of the supernatural out of the service. So, he did not believe in a personal Messiah. He did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. He had a list of things that he, intentionally cut out of the service that I believe Reconstructing still takes out of the service, as far as I'm aware of. Primarily a lot of what we refer to as supernatural elements of the service. So conservative would kind of reinterpret, re-understand what that looks like, what that means, and why do we say it. But, that's a difference in ideology kind of generally. And, Barbara Ayland.
I know we're running late, but as a Reformed Jew all my life, and I still consider myself a Reformed Jew, what Esther and you were describing as Reconstructionist sounds a lot like what I grew up as a Reformed Jew. And the comment I want to make is, it's all well and good to keep what is meaningful to you and then jettison the rest. But the problem is, if you completely jettison it out of your system, you can't get it back when it would be meaningful. So it sort of implies that what's meaningful when you're 20 is the same as what's meaningful to you when you're 50. And that's not true. So having my kids go to the day school and sort of relearning all these other things about Judaism was very powerful, because, and I think that was the idea of Reform Judaism. They knew all the things, so they could pick what was meaningful to them. But 2 generations later, we didn't know anything. So
yeah, I think the distinction between, again, conservative rabbi, not Reconstructionist or Reform. My understanding is the distinction there is Reform tends to put a lot more on the individual to decide what is meaningful for them. So, there are Reformed Jews out there who wear tzitzit and put on talit and tefillin every day because they feel that to be personally meaningful. But it's a lot more of an individual responsibility of deciding what is meaningful in your personal observance. Whereas reconstructing, I think, looks at the big picture of Jewish society and says, if they clearly this isn't meaningful because they're not observing it. And so therefore we can't really consider it a norm of the society if like the vast majority are not actually observing it. So I think the distinction is between the communal and the individual, at least as those two movements see it. Any closing thoughts, comments? So I believe next week we'll look at chapter 2. I'll email you guys direct, but we'll talk a little bit about both what is it? Okay, so that's the God that we're talking about. Now, what is it? How does that affect us and the world in which we live in? So, what is our role in the world, and what is God's role in the world that we inhabit? And we'll learn about that more next week. So, kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for learning together, and wishing everyone a good week. I hope to see y'all at Torah on Tap tonight at Back 40. Musical Shabbat service tomorrow night with our new davening team. It's going to be awesome. And Veterans Shabbat Saturday morning. So lots going on, and I hope to see y'all. And if I don't, Shabbat Shalom. And I hope to see y'all at least next Thursday.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great class.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.